The air in the Vanguard Steakhouse was not merely air, it was a currency. It smelled of old leather, Cohiba cigars, and the seared fat of dry-aged beef, an atmosphere so thick with power you could practically leverage it. For 22-year-old Amelia Vance, it was the air she breathed for 10 hours a day, a suffocating perfume of a world she served but could never inhabit. She moved through it like a phantom in a starched black apron, her presence as fleeting as the condensation on a water glass. Tonight, the gravitational center of this universe was the coveted corner booth, a throne of plush red leather known as the Citadel. It was occupied by gods. At its head sat Julian Croft, a man whose face was etched onto the Mount Rushmore of American industry. Croft, founder of Croft Manufacturing, was a titan of the old school, a man who had built an empire from a single machine shop in a dusty Illinois garage. His hair was silver, but his eyes were the color of forged steel, sharp and missing nothing. At 68, he wasn't just in the room, he was the foundation it was built on. Across from him, radiating a reptilian stillness, was Alistair Finch. If Croft was a builder, Finch was a demolitions expert. He didn't create companies, he acquired them, stripped them for parts and sold the scrap, leaving a wake of shattered towns and unemployed families. His smile was a thin, bloodless slash in a face that seemed immune to joy. Between them, acting as the eager, brilliant bridge, was Marcus Thorne. At 35, Thorne was Croft's golden boy, his heir apparent. Dressed in a suit that cost more than Amelia's car, he radiated a restless, predatory ambition that he barely disguised as loyalty. He was explaining the final details of the deal, his voice a smooth, confident purr. Amelia approached the table, her movements economical and silent, honed by years of practice. She was there to refill water glasses, a task so menial it rendered her invisible. It was this invisibility that had become her greatest shield and her most powerful observational tool. "And the synergy is undeniable, Julian," Thorne was saying, gesturing towards a thick, leather-bound report on the table. "By absorbing Finch Consolidated's logistics network, we cut our supply chain costs by 40%. It's not just an acquisition, it's a fortification of our legacy. The $250 million is a bargain." Finch said nothing, merely steepling his long, pale fingers, his eyes fixed on Croft. He knew the art of silence, of letting the other man's own people make the sale. Croft grunted, his gaze fixed on the document. He was a man who trusted his gut, but his gut had been subcontracted to Marcus Thorne for the better part of a decade. He trusted the boy. He'd mentored him, treated him like the son he'd never had. "The numbers hold up, Marcus? No skeletons?" "Ironclad," Thorne assured him with a dazzling smile. "I personally led the due diligence. Every asset is accounted for, every liability declared. It's the cleanest balance sheet I've ever seen." Amelia's heart, usually a steady, muffled drum, gave a painful, violent lurch. It was a name. Finch Consolidated. A name that had been a curse whispered in her home for as long as she could remember. A name synonymous with ruin. She tried to focus on the heavy glass pitcher in her hand, the way the ice clinked, the perfect arc of the water as it filled Julian Croft's glass. "It's not your world, Amy. It's not your fight." But then Thorne, in a gesture of finality, slid the report to the center of the table, turning it so Croft could see the final summary page. It was upside down from Amelia's perspective, a sea of text and figures. But her mind didn't see it that way. Her father, David Vance, had been a forensic accountant, a bloodhound who could sniff out a lie buried under a mountain of numbers. He wasn't just a numbers guy, he was a philosopher of finance. "Amy," he used to tell her, spreading ledgers across their kitchen table, "most people lie with words. The truly dangerous ones lie with numbers. But numbers have a tell, just like a bad poker player. You have to learn to read the table, not just the cards." Before Alistair Finch had destroyed him, he had taught her everything. He'd trained her mind, turning it into a fine-tuned instrument of pattern recognition. He'd give her complex financial statements and time her on finding the inconsistencies. It was their game, a game that had ended when Finch had framed him for the very fraud he was about to expose, leaving him bankrupt, professionally disgraced, and dead from a heart attack 6 months later at the age of 52. Amelia was 16. Now looking at the report upside down, a decade of her father's lessons screamed in her mind. It wasn't one thing. It was a dozen small, almost imperceptible things. The kerning on the font in the footnotes of Appendix C was tighter than the rest of the document. The page numbering for the asset amortization schedules used a slightly different serif. The indentation on the consolidated liabilities column was off by 2 millimeters. To anyone else, it was meaningless. To Amelia, it was a blaring alarm. It was her father's signature tell for what he called a sandbagged report, a document where genuine, audited pages were carefully swapped with fraudulent ones designed to look identical, hiding catastrophic debt or worthless assets in plain sight. Finch had used this exact method to ruin her father, and now they were using it to trap Julian Croft. Croft picked up a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket. The investors were lined up. The press releases were written. This was the final ceremonial act. He uncapped the pen, the soft click echoing in the sudden ringing silence of Amelia's world. She saw her father's tired, defeated face. She saw the foreclosure sign on their front lawn. She saw the smug, predatory smile on Alistair Finch's face from an old newspaper clipping. The fire she thought had been extinguished by years of grief and grinding survival roared to life, hot and righteous in her chest. Julian Croft lowered the nib of the pen toward the signature line. Amelia moved. She didn't think. She acted. Her body, a servant's vessel, executed a perfect, professional maneuver. She leaned in, ostensibly to clear a non-existent crumb from the tablecloth near Croft's elbow. Her smile was the practiced, vacant smile of the service industry. Her voice, however, was not. It was a low, urgent whisper, meant for him and him alone. "Mr. Croft," she breathed, her lips just inches from his ear. "Don't sign it." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening in his shoulders. He continued to lower the pen, assuming he'd misheard. "That's the wrong report," she whispered again. The words a tiny, impossible detonation in the opulent silence. Julian Croft's world operated on the principles of leverage, inertia, and calculated risk. It did not include cryptic warnings from waitresses. For a full second his mind buffered, trying to place the data point. It was an error, an auditory ghost. He was a 68-year-old man in a loud restaurant. He half-turned, his steel-gray eyes finding hers. He saw a young woman, no older than his own granddaughter, with dark, haunted eyes that held an impossible weight of conviction. There was no mockery in them, no hint of a prank. There was only a terrifying, absolute certainty that jolted him more than a shout would have. His hand holding the pen that would sign away $250 million froze a hair's breadth from the paper. "What was that?" His voice was a low growl, a rumble of thunder on a clear day. The other men at the table fell silent. The rhythm of the deal was broken. Marcus Thorne's easy smile tightened at the edges. Alistair Finch's reptilian stillness became predatory. "Is there an issue, Julian?" Finch asked, his voice smooth as silk sliding over a razor's edge. Amelia straightened up, her professional mask clicking back into place. Her heart was a frantic hummingbird in her chest. She had just thrown a match into a powder keg. Her life as she knew it, the meager, stable life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her past, was over. "My sincerest apologies, sir," she said, her voice a model of decorum, clear and steady despite the tremor in her soul. "I must have been mistaken. Please, continue." She began to back away, the primal urge to flee screaming through every nerve. But Julian Croft was not a man who ignored anomalies. It was how he'd built his empire, by noticing the small crack in the gear before it shattered the entire machine. "No," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the restaurant. "You weren't mistaken. You were clear. Say it again." Marcus Thorne finally broke, a puff of indignant laughter escaping his lips. "Julian, for heaven's sake, it's the help. She's probably confused." He shot Amelia a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a look that promised not just termination, but annihilation. "You are so fired," it said. Amelia's eyes met Thorne's, and in that fleeting moment, Croft saw something that stunned him. It wasn't fear. It was a flash of cold, intellectual contempt. It was the look of a superior assessing an inferior. She turned her gaze back to Croft, her decision made. She had already stepped off the cliff. She might as well learn to fly on the way down. "It's the wrong report," she repeated, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, resonant statement that carried across the table. "It's a sandbag document. Page 47, Appendix C, the amortization schedule for the offshore assets. The font kerning is 0.02 points tighter than the main body. The page numbers on the subsequent 12 pages use a different serif font, a Garamond instead of a Times New Roman. It's a subtle but classic substitution method for inserting falsified data into an otherwise legitimate report." The silence that followed was profound. It was a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Alistair Finch's eyebrows twitched, the only sign he was even breathing. Marcus Thorne's face, which had been a mask of condescending amusement, was rapidly draining of all color. He looked at Amelia as if she had just sprouted a second head and started speaking in tongues. Mr. Croft stared at her, his mind reeling. She hadn't said, "The numbers look fishy." She hadn't offered a vague feeling. She had cited page numbers, appendices, and goddamn font kerning. It was the kind of detail a lunatic wouldn't know, and a liar couldn't invent on the spot. "That is the most absurd, ridiculous thing I have ever heard," Thorne stammered, his voice a full octave higher than before. "She's insane. Julian, this is a tactic, a distraction, probably a plant from a competitor." "Is it, Marcus?" Croft said softly, his eyes never leaving Amelia's face. "You said you personally led the due diligence. Did you happen to notice the typography?" "The typo? Of course not. I was analyzing the financial data, not proofreading the typesetting." Thorne sputtered, his panic making him clumsy. It was the wrong answer. The old Julian Croft, the one who built his business from the ground up, would have noticed. The old Julian Croft would have lived in the details. He saw in Thorne's dismissal a reflection of his own recent complacency. Slowly, deliberately, Julian Croft placed the cap back on his fountain pen. The click was a deafening crack that sealed the fate of the $250 million deal. He placed the pen neatly beside the unsigned contract. "Alistair," he said, turning to Finch, his voice a mask of chilling politeness, "it appears one of my staff has raised a typographical concern. You'll understand that I can't proceed until we verify the integrity of the document's font choices. My apologies." He then locked his gaze on his protege. "Marcus, stay here. Don't say a word. Don't move." Croft stood up, his large frame seeming to suck all the remaining oxygen from the alcove. The force of his personality was a physical presence. He looked at Amelia, who stood frozen, her apron suddenly feeling like a lead weight. "You," he commanded, "with me, now." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned and strode away from the table, carving a path through the gawking diners. Amelia felt the burn of 100 pairs of eyes. Her manager, a perpetually panicked man named Jean-Pierre, was already gliding towards her, his face a mask of horror. "Vance, qu'est-ce que tu fais? What are you doing?" he hissed. Before she could form a reply, Croft's voice boomed across the dining room. He had stopped at the grand entrance, turning back to face the entire restaurant, which had fallen into a hushed silence. He didn't shout, but his voice had the resonant authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed by thousands. "Jean-Pierre," he said, using the manager's name with a terrifying familiarity, "Ms. Vance is no longer on your staff. She is now under my employ as a consultant. Put her final paycheck, plus a generous severance, and any damages to the restaurant's delicate sensibilities on my tab." Jean-Pierre froze, his mouth hanging open like a stunned fish. Amelia untied the strings of her apron, the simple knot that had bound her to this life for 5 long years. She let it fall to the floor. She took one last look at the table, at Alistair Finch's face, now a mask of cold fury, and at Marcus Thorne, who looked like a man watching his own ghost rise from the grave. Then, with her back straight and her head held high, she walked away from her job, away from the life of quiet servitude she had built, and followed the billionaire out into the biting Chicago wind, leaving the ruins of a $250 million deal in her wake. She had avenged nothing yet, but for the first time in a decade, the suffocating air had begun to clear. The ride in Julian Croft's Bentley was a silent, mobile interrogation chamber. The city lights of Chicago smeared across the tinted windows as the car sliced through the night. The interior smelled of old money and new technology, a world away from the lingering scent of steak and desperation that clung to Amelia's uniform. She sat ramrod straight on the supple leather, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Croft didn't look at her. He stared out the window, his face illuminated in strobing flashes of neon. He was processing, his mind a massive, powerful engine slowly grinding through an impossible new reality. Finally, as the car pulled into the hushed, cavernous underground garage of a monolithic glass and steel skyscraper bearing his name, he spoke. "My office. We'll talk there." The private elevator ascended in unnerving silence. It opened directly into a penthouse office that was less a room and more a kingdom. One entire wall was a panoramic window showcasing a God's eye view of Lake Michigan and the glittering city. The furniture was understated but monumental. A desk carved from a single piece of reclaimed walnut, leather chairs that looked a century old. It was an office built to intimidate governments. "Whiskey?" Croft asked, moving to a crystal decanter. "No, thank you, sir." He poured one for himself, the amber liquid catching the light. He took a slow sip, his steel gray eyes finally locking on her. "Start talking, and don't leave anything out. Who are you?" "My name is Amelia Vance. And you're a waitress who moonlights as a typography expert?" The question was laced with a thick, corrosive skepticism. He was giving her one chance to convince him he hadn't just committed professional suicide in a steakhouse. "My father was David Vance," she said, the name falling into the quiet room like a stone into a deep well. Croft froze, the whiskey glass halfway to his lips. A flicker of something, recognition, memory, regret, crossed his face. David Vance, the accountant, from the Omnicorp collapse about a decade ago. Brilliant man. They said he was cooking the books. "He wasn't," Amelia said, her voice low but unwavering. "He was framed. He found the fraud, and the man he was about to expose buried him first. That man was Alistair Finch." Croft slowly lowered his glass, the pieces beginning to click into place with an awful grinding sound. "Finch Consolidated was the parent company of Omnicorp. Yes, my father taught me everything he knew. He believed financial documents had a language, a personality. He taught me to spot the forgeries, the tells. He called the technique he saw tonight the Finch feint. A series of minor, almost invisible document inconsistencies to mask the insertion of fraudulent pages. Finch used it to destroy him, and you were about to sign a report that had all the same fingerprints." Croft was silent for a long time, pacing slowly in front of the vast window, a lion in his cage. He had built his reputation on trust, on the handshake deals of a bygone era. He'd trusted Marcus Thorne implicitly. The thought that he had been so close to being fleeced, so close to handing his legacy over to his nemesis on a silver platter, was a cold, sickening pill. "Thorne," he finally said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Marcus has been with me since he was an intern. I saw him as a son." "Men like Finch don't have partners," Amelia said, echoing one of her father's old adages. "They have tools, and when the tool is no longer useful, they discard it." Croft stopped pacing and turned to her, his face a grim mask. "You've made an extraordinary claim, Ms. Vance. An accusation that, if true, means my heir apparent is a traitor and I'm a blind old fool. If you're wrong, you've not only cost me the biggest deal in my company's history, you've publicly humiliated me for no reason. You understand the stakes?" "I understand that my father died because no one would listen to him when he said exactly what I'm saying to you now. I have nothing left to lose, Mr. Croft. Do you?" The challenge hung in the air, sharp and glittering. It was a direct hit to his pride, his intelligence, his very identity as a shrewd, self-made man. He walked to his immense desk and pressed a button on his intercom. "Get me Henderson, head of IT. I don't care if he's sleeping. Get him here in 20 minutes. And get a security team to lock down the entire executive floor. No one in or out without my direct authorization, especially not Thorne." He looked back at Amelia, his decision made. "All right, Ms. Vance, you claim there's a snake in my garden. You're going to help me find it. You'll have access to a secure terminal. I want you to walk me through the due diligence files Marcus's team compiled. Show me the impossibilities. Show me the lies. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished wood, his face inches from hers. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. But I'm warning you, if this is a ghost story, if you can't show me concrete proof, the wind in Chicago gets very cold when you don't have a friend in the world. For the next 8 hours, the penthouse office of Croft Manufacturing was transformed into a war room. Henderson, a frazzled, caffeine-fueled IT wizard, set Amelia up at a terminal displaying 4 monitors, granting her read-only access to the labyrinthine data vaults where the Finch deal documentation was stored. Croft didn't leave her side. He stood behind her, a silent, intimidating presence, watching her every move. At first, his skepticism was a palpable force in the room. He challenged her on every point, his questions like precision-guided missiles. That's a standard debt-to-equity ratio for a logistics firm, Ms. Vance. It is for a domestic firm, Mr. Croft, she replied without looking up from the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. But 3 of Finch's largest subsidiaries are registered in the Cayman Islands. Their ratios should be significantly lower due to different tax laws. The numbers in this summary are copy-pasted from their domestic reports. It's lazy, but it's the first layer of the lie. She dove deeper, her mind a symphony of numbers and ratios. The years of drudgery, of serving food and clearing tables, melted away. She was her father's daughter again, alive and on the hunt. She moved through shell corporations and holding companies like a shark through water. She cross-referenced shipping manifests from a Singaporean subsidiary with fuel purchase orders from a Panamanian supplier, revealing that Finch's Pacific Fleet, a key asset in the deal, couldn't possibly have moved the volume of cargo they claimed. The numbers showed ships running on phantom fuel. "They're ghost ships," she murmured, pointing to a discrepancy. "The maintenance logs are falsified. These vessels haven't been seaworthy for 5 years. They're scrap metal sitting in a Malaysian port, but they're on your asset list for $80 million. Croft's silence was no longer skeptical. It was the heavy, compressed silence of a man watching his world tilt on its axis. The trust he had placed in Marcus Thorne was not just misplaced, it had been used as a weapon against him. Around 3 a.m., they hit a wall. The core financial data for Finch's most critical offshore holdings was locked behind a formidable wall of encryption. "It's military grade," Henderson said, shaking his head. "We can't brute force this without triggering a dozen alarms and a self-destruct sequence that would wipe the servers clean. We're locked out." Croft swore, slamming his fist on the desk. The frustration was radiating from him in waves. "It's not enough. Ghost ships, cooked books. It's enough to kill the deal, but it's circumstantial. Finch and Thorne will claim it was an oversight, a clerical error. I need the smoking gun. I need the proof of collusion." Amelia stared at the encryption prompt blinking on the screen. Her mind was racing. This wasn't a standard corporate security measure. This was a vault, and a vault always has a key. What would be the key? Something personal, something meaningful to the conspirators? She thought about Thorne, his ambition, his arrogance. She thought about Finch, his cold reptilian nature. What connected them? What secret password would bind a traitor and a shark? Then it came to her, an echo from the past, a detail from the newspaper articles she had obsessed over after her father's death. Alistair Finch's first major corporate raid, the one that made his name, was the hostile takeover of a small steel company called Argent Industries. He hadn't just taken it over, he had liquidated it, destroying a town in the process. The date of the final SEC filing, the day his victory was complete, was October 12th, 1988. 1988. It was his genesis. And what about Thorne? What was his price? Croft had mentioned Thorne's only weakness, a source of private shame. He had come from nothing, burdened by the massive student debt from his MBA program at Northwestern. He had paid it off with his first big bonus from Croft. "Mr. Croft," Amelia said slowly, "what was the exact amount of Marcus's first-year bonus?" Croft looked startled. "I don't know. 100,000. No, wait. He made a big deal about it. He'd done exceptionally well on the Peterson merger. It was $187,500. An odd number. Why? Maybe it was his price, she whispered. She turned to the keyboard. She took a deep breath. She typed in a sequence of characters. Argent Tanawan, Kumanuan Enerwant, 1 She hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, the screen froze. Henderson started to shake his head. It's not going to... The screen flashed green. Access granted. The encrypted vault opened. It contained a hidden ledger, a series of untraceable wire transfers from a shell corporation owned by Finch to a private account in Thorne's name, totaling millions of dollars over 5 years. And it contained one other thing, a folder labeled Legacy. Inside was a single audio file. Amelia clicked play. Marcus Thorne's voice, the same smooth, confident voice from the restaurant, filled the silent office. But this time, he was speaking to Alistair Finch. He's completely bought in, Thorne's voice said, tinny and conspiratorial. The old man trusts me more than he trusts his own reflection. Once the deal is signed, the assets are transferred. You trigger the debt covenants in the fine print we buried on page 92. It will force a default. Croft Manufacturing will be in breach, and the penalty clause gives you control of his entire patent portfolio. We'll bankrupt him within 6 months. He'll never see it coming. There was a pause, then Finch's cold, thin voice. And your legacy, Marcus? You'll be the CEO of the gutted remains. The king is dead, Thorne's voice replied, laced with a chilling arrogance. Long live the king. He's a dinosaur, Alistair. It's our time. The recording ended. No one spoke. The sound of Thorne's betrayal echoed in the vast, silent office. Julian Croft sank into his chair, the life draining from his face. He looked for the first time like an old man. The steel in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had been stabbed in the back by the son he never had. Amelia saved the files to a secure, isolated drive. She had the smoking gun. She had the proof. She had her father's vindication. Just as she was about to unplug the drive, an alert flashed on Henderson's master console, a red blinking warning. Oh my God, Henderson whispered. There's a remote wipe command being executed. It's coming from Thorne's home IP address. He must have a back door. He's trying to erase the servers. Can you stop it? Croft barked, jolting back to life. No, it's already past the firewalls. It'll take 30 seconds for the data to be gone forever. Amelia didn't hesitate. There was no time to think. She looked at the terminal, then at the thick bundle of network cables running into the wall. She grabbed the heavy crystal whiskey decanter from Croft's desk, a full liter of 25-year-old Macallan, and swung it with all her might. The decanter shattered against the wall port, showering the area in glass, whiskey, and sparks. The connection was physically severed. On the screen, a message appeared. Network connection lost. Command failed. The data was safe. The silence that followed was broken only by the sharp, alcoholic scent of the spilled whiskey and the sound of Julian Croft's slow, deliberate breathing. He looked at the shattered decanter, then at Amelia, her chest heaving, her hand bleeding from a shard of glass. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. The weariness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a titan who had just been reminded why he was king. Ms. Van the air, thick with the ghost of 25-year-old Macallan and the acrid tang of burnt electronics, crackled with a new and terrible energy. Julian Croft's smile wasn't one of relief. It was the baring of teeth by a predator that had forgotten the taste of a true hunt and was suddenly, ravenously reminded. The weariness in his eyes had not vanished but had been forged into something harder, colder. It was the look of a king who had discovered a traitor in his court, and in doing so, had rediscovered the iron in his own soul. Miss Vance, he said, his voice a low, terrifying calm that vibrated through the opulent office. There will be consequences for Marcus. There will be ruin for Alistair Finch. That is a given. That is simple physics. But that is not enough. He walked to the panoramic window, the glittering tapestry of Chicago spread beneath him like a conquest waiting to be reclaimed. Men like Finch don't fear prison. They fear irrelevance. They fear erasure. I am not going to send him to jail. I am going to unwrite his name from the history of this city. I am going to turn his empire into a footnote on my balance sheet. And you are going to show me how." He turned, and his gaze was not that of an employer to an employee, but of a general to his single most effective weapon. "I don't need a consultant. I need a strategist. I need the mind that saw the lie in the kerning of a font. I need the ghost of David Vance. The board convenes at dawn. Rest if you can. Your life as a phantom is over. From this moment on, you will learn to haunt the powerful." Sleep was an impossibility. In a guest suite, more luxurious than any home she had ever known, Amelia stood under a scalding shower, not to wash away the grime of her old life, but to try and feel the reality of the new one. The water sluiced over the small bandaged cut on her hand, a wound sustained while saving a Titan's legacy, a tiny, bloody price of admission to a world she had only ever viewed through a keyhole. Her reflection in the fog mirror was a stranger's. The haunted, tired eyes were the same, but they were lit from within now by a cold, righteous fire. She was not just a daughter seeking vengeance anymore. She had become an instrument of it, and the weight of that responsibility was more terrifying and exhilarating than anything she had ever known. The 7 a.m. boardroom was a theater of power, all granite, steel, and hushed expensive fabrics. The air was thick with the scent of old money and fresh coffee. Amelia, dressed in a simple but elegant suit procured by Croft's unflappable assistant, sat to his right. She was a ghost at the feast, an anomaly the board members, a collection of men and one woman who measured their lives in fiscal quarters, could not compute. They looked past her, through her, their gazes dismissive, irritated at the ungodly hour of the summons. When Marcus Thorne entered, he was a masterpiece of controlled contrition. His suit was immaculate, his face etched with a convincing mask of weary concern. He began his performance, a well-rehearsed soliloquy about a disturbed employee, a misunderstanding, a deal that could still be salvaged. He was attempting to shrink the evening's cataclysm into a manageable HR-level incident. Julian Croft let him speak. He allowed the poison of the lies to fill the room, to hang in the air like smoke. He watched his board members, saw the nods of understanding, the desire to believe Thorne, to return to the comfortable, profitable status quo. When Thorne finally finished, gesturing dismissively at Amelia as the source of the unfortunate episode, Croft didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a single, small digital audio recorder on the vast, polished granite table. "You speak of a disturbed employee, Marcus," Croft said, his voice a quiet dirge that cut through the room's tension. "But I find myself disturbed by a different matter entirely, a matter of legacy." He looked around the table, his eyes locking with each board member's. "Our legacy, this company, it was built on a principle so old-fashioned it has become revolutionary. Trust. Our word has been our bond, our handshake, a contract." He slid the recorder to the center of the table. "And that legacy was sold, not for 30 pieces of silver, but for $187,500 and the promise of a stolen crown." He pressed play. Thorne's voice, stripped of its boardroom polish and slick with conspiratorial greed, echoed in the cathedral-like silence. "The old man trusts me more than he trusts his own reflection. We'll bankrupt him within 6 months. The king is dead. Long live the king." The recording played out. The effect was not explosive. It was implosive. The air was sucked from the room. The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face, leaving a waxy, greenish pallor. The board members weren't looking at Croft anymore. They were staring at Thorne with the cold, reptilian horror of predators who have just discovered a fatal sickness in their pack leader. Thorne began to babble, a pathetic cascade of excuses and accusations aimed at Finch. But Croft raised a single hand, and the whimpering died. "Security is waiting for you, Marcus," Croft said, the softness of his voice more chilling than any shout. "The authorities will follow, but that is the least of your concerns. Your real punishment will not be a prison cell. It will be your life. You will be a pariah. Every door you knock on will be slammed in your face. Every bridge you built has been burned. The name Thorne will be a synonym for traitor in this city for as long as you live. You craved a legacy? You have one. Now get out of my sight." Thorne, a broken, shambling wreck, was escorted out. The door clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality. Croft turned to his stunned board. "The deal with Finch is dead. That is the end of the old business." He looked at Amelia, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "And this is the beginning of the new. We are not retreating. We are not regrouping. We are attacking." Ms. Vance's analysis has revealed that Finch Consolidated is not a fortress. It is a rotted-out shack held together by lies and leverage. It's a house of cards in a hurricane. "And we," he said, a predatory gleam in his eyes, "are the hurricane." The next 6 months were not a war. They were a vivisection. Under the official title of Chief Strategic Analyst, Amelia became the architect of Alistair Finch's destruction. It was a brutal, relentless, and deeply intimate process. She did not sleep in the guest suite again, but in a small, Spartan apartment Croft had arranged for her near the office. She lived on black coffee and the cold, thrilling clarity of the hunt. This was not a world of dramatic presentations. It was a silent, grinding war fought in the spectral glow of computer monitors at 3 in the morning. She and Croft worked side by side, a strange pairing of the old bull and the young matador. He brought the decades of instinct, the knowledge of the players, the sheer weight of his power. She brought the scalpel. She felt her father's presence constantly, not as a ghost demanding vengeance, but as a teacher whose lessons had finally found their ultimate application. "Look for the patterns, Amy. The lie is always in the pattern." She found them. She unraveled shell corporations that led to phantom assets. She cross-referenced SEC filings with obscure maritime law to prove his shipping fleet was a multi-million-dollar insurance scam. She dug into his political donations and found the quid pro quo that had buried a toxic environmental report. Each discovery was a missile, launched not at the headlines, but at Finch's credit lines, his investors, his insurers. She wasn't just exposing his fraud, she was systematically dismantling the machinery of his power. There were moments of crippling doubt, nights when she would stare at her reflection and see only a tired, hollowed-out woman, fueled by a purpose that felt increasingly corrosive. Was this justice, or just a more sophisticated form of destruction? In those moments, Croft, with an almost paternal intuition, would appear in her doorway. He wouldn't offer platitudes. He'd simply place a file on her desk. "Found this in the archives," he'd grumble. "A letter from your father to our then CFO from 11 years ago, warning him about Finch's business practices. We ignored it." It was his way of saying, "This isn't just your fight, it's my penance." The end for Alistair Finch came not with a bang, but with the silent, inexorable constriction of a python. His lenders called in his loans. His stock became worthless. The SEC, armed with a mountain of meticulously documented evidence provided by Amelia, froze his personal assets. He was ruined. The day the final acquisition papers were signed, Croft Manufacturing absorbing the skeletal remains of Finch Consolidated for pennies on the dollar, there was no celebration, no champagne. Julian Croft walked into Amelia's office, where she was staring out the window at the now gray Chicago sky. "It's done," he said. "I know," she replied, not turning around. "There's one last thing I need to do." He simply nodded. "My car is waiting." The former Finch Consolidated building was a tomb. A skeleton crew of security guards watched as Amelia and Croft walked through the cavernous lobby, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The power was partially cut, and the dim emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows. They rode the elevator in silence to the penthouse floor. Alistair Finch was there, as Amelia knew he would be. He sat behind his enormous obsidian desk, a lone king in a ruined castle, impeccably dressed in a suit that was now worthless. He wasn't ranting or broken. He was eerily calm, a specimen of pure, unadulterated narcissism under a microscope. "The daughter of the accountant," he said, his voice a dry rustle. He looked at Amelia, a flicker of something that might have been academic curiosity in his cold eyes. "I remember him. He was sanctimonious. He thought numbers had a soul, an amateur's mistake." "My father believed numbers told a story," Amelia said, her voice steady, clear. "And your story was a lie." Finch almost smiled. Storytelling is the only business there is, my dear. The story of value, the story of growth, the story of power. Your Mr. Croft tells his story, I told mine. His simply had a more bombastic ending. Bravo. He made a small, ironic gesture of applause. He looked at her, his gaze turning venomous. But don't fool yourself. You didn't do this for justice. You did it for revenge. You enjoyed tearing me down just as much as I enjoyed building myself up. You have the same bloodlust. You've just dressed it up in prettier clothes. You are no different from me. It was his last, most poisonous arrow, aimed at the heart of her doubt. For a moment it found its mark. She felt the cold truth in his words, the thrill she had felt with every victory, every unraveled lie. She looked past him, out the window at the city. She thought of her father, not of his death, but of his life. The late nights at the kitchen table, the smell of paper and coffee, the passion in his voice as he explained the elegant, beautiful truth of a balanced ledger. He wasn't a destroyer. He was a believer, a man who believed in order, in fairness, in the idea that things should add up. You're wrong, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. She finally turned her gaze from the window to meet his. You see the world as a collection of assets to be stripped. My father taught me to see it as a system to be balanced. You destroy, we build. That's the difference. This wasn't revenge. It was a reconciliation, an entry on the other side of the ledger to correct a catastrophic error. You were the error, Mr. Finch. She had not raised her voice. She had not condemned him. She had simply dismissed him, rendered him irrelevant. A rounding error in a story that was no longer about him. The mask of reptilian calm on Alistair Finch's face finally, irrevocably shattered. In his eyes, for the first time, she saw what he truly feared. Not ruin, not prison, but the profound, annihilating terror of being nothing at all. She turned and walked out. Julian Croft, a silent, imposing shadow behind her. She didn't look back. A year to the day after the confrontation at the Vanguard, Amelia stood not in a new office, but on a windswept plot of undeveloped land on the south side of the city. A cold autumn wind whipped strands of hair across her face. Beside her, Julian Croft leaned heavily on a cane, a new concession to the toll the last year had taken on him. The fire in his eyes had banked, replaced by a deep, weary satisfaction. He handed her a thick portfolio. It wasn't a legal document. It was a set of architectural blueprints. The David Vance Institute for Applied Ethics, the title block read. It's not a foundation, Amelia. It's a school. We won't just be funding scholarships. We're going to train a new generation of accountants, analysts, and regulators. We'll teach them to read the stories in the numbers. We'll teach them how to spot the next Alistair Finch before he happens. It's your legacy to build, your story to write. She traced the lines of the blueprint with her finger, her vision blurring. It wasn't a monument to the past. It was a blueprint for the future. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. There's one more thing, Croft said, turning to face her. The board officially voted me to the chairman emeritus position this morning. They also voted on my replacement as CEO. Amelia looked up at him, a dozen questions in her eyes. It wasn't you, he said, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. You're not ready. Not yet. You're a brilliant strategist, a once-in-a-generation analyst, but you don't know how to build a company yet. You only know how to dismantle one. That will be your next lesson. He looked out over the land toward the distant gleaming towers of the city. I came to this city with nothing. I built an empire. You came to it with nothing but a name to clear. You saved one. The work is never truly done, is it? She looked from the blueprints in her hands to the skyline. She was no longer the phantom waitress, invisible in the world of gods. She was no longer just the avenging daughter, haunted by the ghost of her father. She had integrated them. She had the waitress's eye for the detail no one else sees, and she had the analyst's mind to understand what it means. She had not set out to conquer this city, only to find a small measure of justice within it. But in balancing the books of the past, she had discovered the infinite, terrifying, and glorious blank ledger of her own future. The air was no longer suffocating. It was just air, and for the first time, she felt like she could finally breathe it.